Okay, I'll start with our new roadmap, which should already be published on our documentation website under the latest tag, of course. Latest roadmap. Yes, I'll quickly share my screen. There it is. So roadmap for next year, or the first 3 quarters of next year. It's more condensed than the previous one. First release somewhere in the first quarter. We don't know exactly. It's mainly maintenance release. If you look at the issues we are fixing right now, the GitHub issues, they don't introduce any new features. So we're processing results from the penetration test. We're processing any feedback we're getting from the different networks. For example, we see some stuff happening in the logs on development and test, or development is stable, and we're trying to get those as clean as possible. There are also a lot of technical issues which are just a cleanup, or which have something to do with the JSON link data and the way we're using it. So there's also a lot of preparation for the next versions. But basically, software should be more stable, have less errors, less unknown logging, all that kind of stuff. We're also using the time. We actually have some spare time to create the designs for the other versions. So for Peanut and Pecan, which requires some more upfront design sessions. So the second release for next year will be about node isolation. Technically, currently we have one DAG, one directed acyclic graph, and that will be split into a DAG per node. This has 2 main reasons to do this. If there's a node that is misbehaving, you can isolate it, and the others will still be able to publish and work normal. And the second reason is that it's actually feature preparation. For example, if you have a node, or we're going to connect multiple domains to a single network. For example, we now have the healthcare domain, but what if we want to do a crossover to the social domain? And some nodes may want to do both domains, and others just want to do healthcare. And this is a way to only get healthcare related DID documents and credentials and that kind of information, and you can ignore other data on the network. And the last one, high availability and clustering. It shouldn't be a surprise that we can now only run a single node. Third release of next year should solve that, and you will be able to run a cluster. Most important reason is the OAuth endpoint, which is in the nuts node. That should be available like 99.999% of the time, which is currently quite hard to do. So that's in short the roadmap. Do you guys have any questions? No. So silence is everything, right? Okay. Next up is the results of our pen test. So we asked Radically Open Security to do a pen test, and to do a pen test on 2 main subjects. One is the state of the cryptographic operations and the cryptographic libraries we used and the code we produced. And the other one is on the APIs the node is exposing, because there's some public APIs and there are some APIs used in node-to-node communication. And they basically provide a gateway for hackers or other ill-willing beings to attack your node. And that's why we have them tested to see what's up with that. Nothing critically came from the test. So we can just share the results. I have to find a report pretty quickly. Could have prepared this, of course, but okay. We did not share this somewhere on a more public space, so we can perhaps put it on the website somewhere in the coming period. Okay, so radically open security. They made a nice report of about 27 pages. Let's see, most important part, scope of the work. So it's on the cryptographic functions and the Let's Node API. And the most important thing for you guys, I think, is the results. These are the results. So you might notice it's 10 issues in total. You might notice that 4 of them are labeled as threat level high. Some of them are being fixed, but some of them are, in our view, not a high threat level because they have to do with using the node insecurely. For example, if you're not using HashiCorp Vault, but you're using file system storage for your private keys, then there's a lot more threats applicable. That's why we advise to use HashiCorp Vault in production and acceptance. And then these threats are not really an issue. So that's let's see if we go through them one by one in a short manner. The first, second, and third issue are all about file system storage of private keys. The fourth one is about how you inject the HashiCorp Vault access token. So if you do that via the command line, it can be readable by other users. So the advice is not to do that by the command line. I think the most of you will be using Docker, and if you're using HashiCorp Vault, it will probably be injected through environment variable. And then it should only be visible within the Docker container, I guess. The input validation has to do with the fact that request URLs get logged in your access log. And if you can create a log entry for each different query parameter, you can create infinite number of logs. And they will all be added to the metrics as a single metric. So there's no regular expression matching in our metrics, which can, if you do this millions of times, can overload your node. Something to note, of course, is that this endpoint should not be open to the public anyway. But if you open it up to the public, then you can have this problem. We'll still fix this, of course, just to tell you something about the impact. The insecurity fault, we addressed this, and we're probably going to switch to strict mode by default. instead of optional. So this will impact your development to stable node or your nodes on your laptop, but it should not impact your acceptance and production nodes, because they should already be running strict mode. So that will be a change in probably the next version. So defaults will change. The info leak, it's a very theoretical attack. It's about if you do anything with private keys in memory and the operating system does something with that memory, for example, swap it out to disk, then your private keys will be listed on disk. So to abuse this vulnerability, you need access to the disk or the Docker container. So you need a lot of privileged access to actually abuse it. Preventing this is very hard. And one of the things we already noticed is that HashiCorp Vault has the exact same threat documented. And I believe they marked it as a won't fix because it's too hard to fix. The other one is sort of the same. When you create private keys, they are left in memory. Then there's a misconfiguration marked as low. So these are, this one is the NTS 10 is an API one, and the metrics one, the NTS 9, oh, sorry about that, is a metrics API thread. So those are the only two API threads. The rest is about cryptographic functions. So all the other APIs, for example, the OAuth endpoint or the public endpoint, didn't give any issues in the pentest. So we sort of could regard them as safe. Right? We labeled this one as won't fix because it's about a discussion how to design APIs, post or put or only bodies or query parameters for a post, that kind of thing. We decided that it's easier for administrators to use curl and other tools and then not required to use a post body. I believe the last one is about some ambiguity in the key checks that have to go to a lower level. It's something that has been noticed in the code audit. So this is a indication that they actually read the code and try to understand what it does. And they reported back these threats. They also reported back some non-findings. So things they said are that you can improve this code without it being a threat. So they really looked at the code in a very detailed level. This is basically it. So all of these issues have been transferred to GitHub, so you can track them if you want to. You can see our comments and you can see in which version they will be fixed. If we're going to fix them, they will be in the next version, so 5.1. Any questions? Okay, cool. Then we can hand it over to Edwin or Jari. They prepared a presentation.
Yeah, I'll just start us off and then I'll call upon Jari when it becomes technical and you guys need to understand it better than just my rambling about diagrams. Yeah, I'll just briefly again say what we do. We're working on the Zorgenzagenbolt and trying to create multiple use cases for Hinq. And I'm going to go through two practical examples today. And the format, I guess, will just talk, and if you have questions or remarks, I guess just interrupt, and then we'll talk about it as we go. I can start sharing my screen. I created a Miro diagram here. Okay. So 2 practical examples what we do. We are for het actueel medicatieoverzicht, so an up-to-date medication overview. We're creating a dashboard in Hinq. So we have Hinq as a web app with its own viewer, where you view multiple sources of healthcare data, for instance, from the pharmacy, the GP, or specialist at the hospital, all combined into one viewer. And yeah, this is kind of a screenshot of one of our screens, where you see different sources and comparing the medication to each other, showing that there's inconsistencies or potentially even potential dangerous combinations. So that's basically the functionality that our users desire. And to make that happen, we have a system where for each source system, we basically provide a NUTS node, and we also provide a FHIR interface, sometimes even FHIR translator, and connect them all to the NUTS network in that way and do all our communication via the NUTS network. So we've been centralizing or we've been using NUTS as our core infrastructure for that data exchange. And because we're doing it on such a quite systemic scale with a lot of different source systems, a lot of different permissions, we've run into some things that that didn't probably weren't foreseen maybe, and things that we noticed that it should be at least taking the position on as NUTS to make it really workable for use cases such as this. And another example is the Baby Connect use case, where we connect kraam, all the English words here are going to be tough, obstetricians, specialists in the hospital again, gynecologists, and echo centra, giving them a similar overview of the pregnancy and also past pregnancies. There's a bit of timeline and client information. And it's really the same concept where we're connecting all the data. Our customers are regional, so we have for AMO a couple of regions, for instance, region Leiden, Zwolle, who have signed us up. For Baby Connect, it's really already on a national scale. So there's a program of Baby Connect, and Hinq was chosen by the majority, if not every region, to provide this functionality. Any questions so far, guys? No? Okay, then I'll go on to the challenges. We have 2 main categories of challenges. The one is that permissions is a tricky one. So every source system that we work with already has their own permission storage and their own. So the permissions are basically the grondslag, the voor gegevenuitwisseling. What's grondslag, guys?
Legal ground?
Legal base.
Yes, thank you. Legal base for data exchange in this case is permission of the patient registered by the professional in their APD or their source system. And not everybody does it the same way. So there's like a push towards also standardizing this with initiatives such as MITS, which is trying to create a centralized solution for it. But as of now, the reality is that everybody does it in their own way. Hospitals have their own way of storing it. Verloskunde have their own way of storing it, and other organizations don't store it at all. Like, for instance, the kraam. And in that case, Hinq had to provide a service that, okay, we're going to store them for you in the ZNO, in our viewer interface, because that's what they required. So that complexity of having different places where it can be is one, and the second complexity is different levels. Right, so the hospital might register global permissions, and with global I mean I will share all the relevant data with all relevant parties. That's quite a broad permission for the hospital to register, but it's also possible that a more narrow permission is registered at the verloskunde, for instance. Like I will share with purely hospitals purely this data set. And then we have to support that as Hinq and map that to the authorization credentials. And that's where it really becomes very tricky because, well, there's not really a communication network from nuts to check like, okay, what is the real permission or what is the permission that's known here. We had to build that network ourselves and then map it to authorization credentials. And in the process of creating this technical solution, kind of the question kept popping up, okay, but what are we using authorization credentials for now, really? What's their value? Because the consents were always leading and they're just another thing we have to keep in sync in this current design. Before I go more detail into the problems, I think I could ask Jari to show the sequence diagram, because I think you guys are more probably familiar with the way that works and with the diagrams I'm showing.
Yeah, so this already partially is very specific to our implementation, because we have this network of nuts nodes, but we needed a like a messaging system. It could have been done with APIs, of course, but messaging was just easier and more asynchronous. So we use nuts for that, for messages between the different nodes. And the way that we're currently implementing this is that in the ZNO, a practitioner will start a permission request. And the permission request is, I want to see this data that another practitioner has, but I don't have access to it, so can I please have access? So in this case, from Hinq, they will do a permission request at the organization that's behind interop node X. That's the second to right line. So the permission request goes to that interop node X, but now what interop node X has to do in order to determine whether authorization can be granted is it needs to check whether consent was given, or that's at least one of the grounds for authorization. So and because every organization has their permission stored in a different way, some have it internally, some have it at Hinq, and some might have it at MIDS. We need to look that up. Well, we can do that with services in Node, so we can register with a service where the consent is stored. So that's a FHIR endpoint then, so that we can just do a FHIR consent record check. Then at that node, which is in this example Chipsoft, at that node we search for consent records. Chipsoft will look up whether consent was given and will give consent records back. After which we will issue an authorization credential. And that authorization credential is then well, just shared over nuts like you normally would, and then a message is sent back over the nuts channel to confirm that authorization was granted, just as like a notification system. So this works, and it's a pretty clean solution, as in with the consent registries being available through a FHIR interface. That's quite well manageable. The issue is, we started wondering at this point, what's the point of the authorization credential? Because next time they want to use that authorization credential to actually get the data from node X, we have to check again whether consent is still valid. Because if consent was retracted in the meantime, then we can't share that data anymore. So at that point, we started to think, couldn't we just simply do this with short-lived access tokens? Because why would you have a long-lived authorization credential if with a short-term access token you could do the same thing and you don't have to worry about keeping that in sync?
Yeah.
So yeah, Ed, do you want to go into this first and then go to the other thing? Or...
Yeah. Well, maybe I would be curious to hear some initial reactions.
Yeah,
maybe
exactly.
Wout and Steven about this problem. What do you think?
Yeah, so it's there are multiple facets of what's happening here, and you could say that the central part here with the authorization credentials, that's the part we sort of standardized, and everything between interrupt node X and Chipsoft interrupt node is custom, right? So there's no standard for that yet. So when you talk about couldn't you use short-lived access token, that would be a different design. So we chose for a design where you can have asynchronous authorization credentials issued because there is a legal base. So it's only a derivative of the legal base that's registered somewhere. Which also means that revocation of an authorization credential can also be done asynchronous. So instead of checking if consent is still valid, as soon as it has been revoked, you can revoke all authorization credentials that were linked to that consent. And then it's again an asynchronous design instead of a synchronous design. So that's what in the very first version of NUTS, in version 0.x, and we still used Corda and stuff like that, we linked it to documents that were signed by clients in electronic health record. But as soon as that document was removed, or the tag was removed that it was a consent record, we also revoked the authorization.
Okay. So
basically, the reason is because in the entire design, what we say, or what NUTS does, is that you're going to request some resources, and with that request, you're going to send along some verifiable credentials that prove you have access. Those credentials come from your wallet, and those should be enough to determine if you have access or not. So the only thing you have to do with those credentials is compare them with the revocation lists that are out there. Similarly, you would do with certificates. But those credentials can be loaded into the wallet of the requester through all kinds of mechanisms. And these authorization credentials are using one certain mechanism, namely publication from the source of the data. So the resource owner is publishing those authorization credentials. But those in the future could also have different sources. For example, a patient that goes to the GP or any other specialist or healthcare organization, and at that point says you may access that resource because I can provide you with a credential that gives you access to that resource without the source being part of that handshake.
Yeah.
So the entire design uses credential that are offered at the time of creating access tokens, which should be enough to determine access.
Yeah.
So there's no, in the design, there's no callback to any other service.
Okay, so if I understand correctly, instead of checking for authorization when a request is made, you flip it around and you make sure that the authorization credentials are kept in sync with the actual legal grounds.
Yeah, because that authorization credential is also scoped to specific access. And you can have multiple authorization credentials working together. And if the one for global access has been revoked, for example, the explicit consent has been revoked, but there are still credentials available because there was a handover from one organization to the other, which is also a valid legal base. That one is still active.
Yeah. Okay.
I see. Well, the issue there is beforehand you will not know what you need the authorization credential for. So usually the initiation of the request is I want to retrieve data at your place, then check for consent, then create the authorization credential.
So the question I had there: are you working together with Baby Connect to standardize the permission request flow?
In this case, because I want to be precise, permission request that Jari mentioned is not the same as the one we worked on during the hackathon, where you're creating a consent credential and all that.
Mm-hmm.
So when we say permission request, it's just checking if in the consent storage of another organization or if of an organization, if there is permission.
Oh, okay. Because I was
that's outside
I understood that you also used the let's say authorization request flow somewhere.
Yeah, no, that's the terminology got mixed up, but no, this whole thing is that's out of scope for now.
Oh, okay, okay.
Registering permission on behalf of some other organization, basically. So here we had to check the consent storages of other organizations. We did need to create something outside of nuts to do that. And in practice, I think that's how data exchange will most often happen. Or is there an alternative way? Because you say you can basically proactively create authorization credentials if you're a consent holder, but you don't know yet who will need it, when they'll need it, etc. That requires a question to go before, right?
So that's the that was one of the other things you mentioned. That's the case when you say, okay, there's global permission is given.
Yeah.
So everybody may access my data. I'm not really sure how, because there's some legislation behind that, of course, what you can do, and we don't want to mix it up with what you're required to do for uitwisselingssystemen.
Yeah.
But
let's talk now about just the simple dossierhouderstoestemming, right? So that's I share my source data with all other practitioners that need it, and for all the data. I think that's the most typical permission registered currently.
Yeah, so I think that one most likely has something to do with the authorization request flow. Because one of there's of course a new NEN norm being developed for this, and one of the questions there is knowing where you're receiving care, is that medical information or not? Which means, can you share it on beforehand with other parties? Because you could argue that if you're a patient in a rehab clinic for alcoholism,
yep,
and you share that with the world, then everybody knows your condition.
Yeah, no, this is true. Wait, just a sec. Our flow doesn't work in that way. It's the patient points to the on the screen, and these are organizations to send the permission request to. It's not some backend information that is being shared. It's just a patient doing a manual action.
But then you could use the authorization request flow, because at the other end, the only thing that should happen is that the source, so the party that's going to hand out those authorizations has to check a couple of different items, right? So there's legislation that says sharing data shouldn't harm anybody in their personal well-being or whatever. So there's all those items.
Yes.
Was the client did it have any consent? Do we have any consent on record beforehand? So that might be your use case. So the patient / client already registered something at the hospital, but it could also be that the client or patient is actually using or actually sending consent with the request.
Yep.
And the level of trust behind that consent, that's something the healthcare organizations in the region or for this use case have to determine together, because you could say it should have a high level of trust, so it should be signed with a passport or something and a chip that lives on it, but that's unusable right now. That's not doable. Or if you can say the patient has to use an authentication means based on their mobile phone and they have to sign something, which is currently also unusable, but maybe in 5 to 10 years it's quite common, because then you will have the proof of consent going with the authorization request. But if you do something like that, the source also has to check, okay, is the patient, I have to check what's it in English,
Wilsbekwaam.
wilsbekwaam.
Yeah.
Is the patient wilsbekwaam in that area?
Mm-hmm.
That's something the source always has to check when some request comes in. So there's always something that should happen on the functional level. Otherwise, you're not allowed to issue that authorization.
Okay, but that's before the authorization credentials issued.
Sorry, Jari?
That is before the authorization credential is issued. So that is
so it could be a really relevant consent given by the patient that says the other party may access my data, but if there is a court appointed mentor, then the source is not allowed to share the data.
Now, okay, I get that approach, like more push based rather than pull based. So not necessarily checking when the actual data request is coming in, but making sure that those authorization credentials are kept in sync. But that's quite challenging, making sure that those authorizations are kept in sync. It is a lot easier to implement for a lot of source systems, I mean, a lot easier to implement that when a request comes in, that you then check, okay, are you allowed to fulfill this request or not? Compared to having each source system synchronize authorization credentials for, proactively, basically. That's up until now what we have found with the source systems that we're cooperating with.
That might depend on how many sources there are to be a source for authorization credentials.
Well, but so you're saying,
yeah, I guess
there's a check taking place when a permission request comes in, and then I'm talking about permission request that you or we defined together a while ago. Then there still has to be indeed this communication or check with the storage of the consents of that receiving organization. There is some standardization missing there, or it would be beneficial to have some standardization of how that organization could indeed communicate and check their consents, because currently that's not really there, and we think it's quite a fundamental communication stream for nuts to work for use cases such as zorginzage, because almost everybody has permissions already stored somewhere. Certainly the big organizations that do a lot of the things themselves, which use nuts nodes or which will be more inclined to use them. And there is currently no standard or documentation of like how consents can map to the authorization credentials and what their API model is, for instance, and things like that. What do you think of putting more effort into standardizing that as nuts, so that we avoid, for instance, centralized organizations coming in and just doing that for them, undermining a bit of the validity of the nuts network?
Yeah, so it's about usability in this case. You're correct in identifying this needs to be, or it's very helpful if it was standardized over all the different use cases.
Yes.
Unfortunately, it's not there yet. So we would be very happy if multiple use cases that have the same problem would work together, identify this and say, okay, let's create a standardized Fire API with standardized results for a callback. or
Yep.
create additional APIs for knowing if there's a red flag in the patient's medical records that you cannot hand out an authorization record by default automatically, and somebody has to look at it, for example. Yeah, so mainly this is work for the different use cases. So I think Zorgenzagen, Baby Connect, everybody, everywhere where it's the same issue. We could help where needed, but there is a pretty big functional requirement in there as well. So we cannot decide it as on a technical level. Healthcare organizations have to be involved in this process.
Yeah, well, for sure that is about, if you're talking about the legal checks that need to be done, yeah, we can only facilitate that with technology. But even if we take the use case where or we don't think of that in the initial instance and just think about how the technical communication from consent and where to check and how you know where to check, standardizing the calls back and forth. I think that would be great value, because now we yeah, you have to build something around it, as we did, to check where externally safe consents are stored. And it does bridge a little bit into the next topic, which we kind of want to still touch on today, and that is the fact that an organization can be registered in multiple nodes, and that creates a bit of a mess occasionally. So just for the sake of time, I think I'm going to go to that, and then some of the previous points will come back, I think.
Yeah, maybe somebody has a closing remark.
Oh, yeah.
Or some different insight.
Yeah, good call.
No, well, just one thing. I think the discussion for about broad permissions and how to do the authorization requests either more proactively, like it was designed, or more short-lived and on request basis. I think that's quite a big discussion, and way too long for the developer meeting. So I think we'll have to get back on that later. Probably have a longer and more in-depth discussion, because there are so many things that we just haven't touched yet.
Yeah, well, what I was thinking is you already having not message broker or queue in place, which is used to sync consents, or at least instruct a node to issue consents. But I was thinking, like, why not you use the same approach for the same queue for evocations, and that part is basically ticked off, or is it too simple?
Yeah, but exactly. So that's where we're going with it now. We're implementing a lot of that, like basically all the messaging between nodes in the network, we're doing through this NUT network. Basically anything that you would maybe otherwise write an API for, and also consents and stuff like that, are all going in that direction. And that seems to be a really good way to solve this. But we would like to be able to do it in the NUTS way. We want to avoid building a whole bunch of other stuff outside of NUTS. Yeah, so that is pragmatically, that's kind of where we're going.
And I think Ryan's question was also like, what's the value of, for instance, nuts versus nuts? To make
No, my thought was like, hey, you have nuts, nuts. Nuts.
Nuts.
Yeah.
In the place, so finally use it for the evocations as well, but that's something you need to internally decide. But one other thing I didn't quite understand, why we have a interop node and a non-interop node, like, yeah, that speakers diagram, you have a Hinq interop node and a interop node?
Oh yeah, that's just one is Hinq's interop node, as in the one that runs for the ZNO. There's the one for Chipsoft that runs for Chipsoft, and then there's just interop node X, which is any other interoperability node. So it's the 3 times the same sort of system, the same type of system.
It's a nuts node, or is the separate application with perhaps a nuts node, or?
The nuts node is part of it. So it
Part.
this also includes Fire interface and stuff.
Okay, so it's a complete application with a nuts node.
Exactly. Yeah.
Interoperability, so it doesn't have a user interface or something. It's meant for connecting multiple networks or something.
Exactly. Yeah, and it has a user interface just for administrative purposes.
Yeah.
But the user doesn't see it.
Yeah, and it's it's meant for translation then, or for accumulation of the data. What I'm wondering about is, why does the Hinq ZNO doesn't connect directly to, for example, the Chipsoft interop node? Why are these things in between?
It does for Fire calls. The ZNO talks directly to the Chipsoft interoperability node, because the interoperability node has a Fire interface that makes data exchange possible with the system that's behind there. In the case of Chipsoft, that's Hinq. So the interoperability node in general is just the nodes that make up the network for data exchange, and part of that is nuts, part of that is Fire.
Okay, but the Hinq ZNO doesn't contain nuts, but the Hinq interop node is something which contains nuts, and the interop node X also contains nuts, but the Chipsoft I got the feeling that the sometimes are combined and are not, right? So
yeah, you should probably see it in a different diagram. The ZNO has each piece of, yeah, there we go. That's a lot better. Each source system, and we count the ZNO as a sort of source system in this case, has their own interoperability node, part of which is the nuts node, but another part of that is the Fire interface, which exposes the data of that source system to the rest of that network. So it's just a software product that runs at each of these source systems, and that makes their data available to the rest of that network, where authorization is based on nuts and localization, etc. So the ZNO uses this network to talk to Chipsoft and to talk to Medicom, and it talks with just the interoperability nodes of each of those systems, not directly with the source system behind it, so that there's one standard interface to talk to each of those parties.
But I would say the idea is that you use this system to directly connect to those end systems. But in the diagram beneath, you've got a sort of a chained sequence. So you connect to the first, that one connects to the second, and perhaps to the third. So why don't they talk directly to each other? Why are they forwarding requests?
Oh no, they're not. No, that wasn't the point of that third sequence diagram. So this is just Hinq needs data from interop node X. So let's say that's Medicom. So the left one is the node that runs for the ZNO. Then the middle one is the one that runs at Medicom. The ZNO user wants data from Medicom, so they send a permission request to Medicom. Well, Medicom finds out that for some doesn't make sense, but for some reason the consent for that GP is stored at Chipsoft. Impossible, but yeah.
Okay, so the Chipsoft interop node is actually the consent store for the Chipsoft.
That's the use here, yeah. But the interop node is also the product that makes the data available, that's stored at Chipsoft, that's stored at Hinq. So this interop thing is multiple things. It's a consent registry, it's a Fire interface, it's a nuts node. Yeah.
Okay, I think you're right that we should dive a little bit deeper into this, and
exactly.
Also this yeah, well, we as nuts, we all always said this is a use case in itself. Somebody should, some group of people should build it like, design it like the E-overdracht, for example, has been designed, or KIKV has been designed by a separate use case group. But I can really imagine that we need some clarity on this point, since it's such a broad usage. It can be used for so many use cases that it's not just as simple as, well, design it and write it down so everybody can use it. We probably should have an opinion and help with it as a bit more than we currently have done. Yeah,
We would be happy to do that more in detailed session, more deep dive sessions.
and it
with
also
you guys.
reminds me, of course, about the initiative we currently have with the MITS.
It's part of this for
product.
sure.
So how can we not so the question is not how can we integrate with MITS, but how can we design a system such that if both of all the consent systems implemented, like NITS and MITS, that they are compatible with each other. So that, and currently, as far as I know, we have got 2 major consent of authorization systems. So these 2 are now working on a bigger picture. Protocols.
Yeah, so all communication or all message exchanges should be based on standards and not on systems.
Yes.
So you can swap out anything anywhere.
Exactly. And yeah, that's exactly the point we were trying to bring, and not just the fact that the standards for this part of, like, how do you handle consents and different forms of consents is currently kind of a gap which we need to fill.
Yeah. And we're probably not fast enough for your use case, but we can, of course, think of some direction we are going into. Write down, like, what we think is the best possible compatibility with the future version, so that you probably only have to change like fields or maybe a standard code system, but that the flow will be basically of mostly the same. So yeah, that's probably what you're asking for, and yeah, let's design that. We should do that.
Yeah, I think that's a good idea. Let's do that.
Yeah, so just throw a proposal on Slack on time.
Yep.
And then maybe a 2-hour window or something.
Yeah, maybe with a whiteboard.
Yeah, maybe as well. Okay, so given the time,
Yeah.
I don't know if everybody still has some time, but or
We
you
don't
guys.
have to go into it, but I can give a teaser.
Okay.
So this is a more simple to grasp issue. I think you guys are aware of it, that the organization credentials are not really optimal for current use with complex situations where an organization is known as multiple nodes. It creates, for instance, the issue that an authorization credential is scoped to an organization credential, which means that's not in line with how the law necessarily sees it. An authorization credential or information by law or grondslag by law is to an organization, not to a organization and a specific node, which means that we have to like do some magic in between with an identifier that we created called the Hinq organization identifier that keeps 2 of them in sync. And to recognize that this is the same organization, just known as multiple nodes, and by deducing from that, we can then pull in the data into this node because we know that it's the same organization. But it creates a spaghetti and some syncing issues by not having one central organization identifier, which can be used by each node.
Yeah,
that's the
That's an challenging issue indeed. I think in short there are multiple solutions, but it depends on the use case. You could say if an organization is registered multiple nodes, you can just authorize credentials to all of those nodes, which has a challenge if a new one arrives. a new piece of software is bought by the care organization, it has a nuts node, and then nothing happens, of course, because the issuance of credentials has already passed. Another one is something we have in draft somewhere, that we add a unique identifier to the organization credential. Problem there, of course, is organizations have to choose their own type of identifier. It does not have a authoritative source because it's just a vendor. And that one still has some challenges with the privacy aspect of authorization credentials. Because it won't be known to the new node, new piece of software, new node, that a authorization credential was mentioned for that node, was authorized for that node.
Yes,
I don't know how to actually get it. So that's a privacy aspect which doesn't help there. Yeah, so it's complicated. I think we have to design it.
So the problem, as I understand it, like, is you've got like care organization. One care organization has 3 vendors, 3 nuts nodes, 3 different DID documents. You can of course issue verifiable credentials with an identity to each of those 3 credentials, the DID documents, and then if you're going to search and all these 3 credentials are the same, then you find 3 different DIDs. And how are you going to create authorization credentials? So you have to issue them to all 3. When a 4th one gets introduced, the source of the issuer should know this and create an extra credential. So if you're switching around from vendors, for example, or then so yeah.
It becomes messy because you need to know which VCs you need to check for.
And especially in the current situation where every vendor can issue this nuts organization credential themselves, so there's no guarantee that these names are all the same. There's no identifier in it.
Or the identifiers are the same, because if somebody makes a typo, then that's of course a huge problem.
Yeah, so you've got the care organization, the regenboog, and the regenboog, and something else. Maybe they use the different location, for example, or so yeah. That's a tricky question, and it has to do, of course, with well, we hope that we hoped that there would be a source of truth, like a trusted third party, like the CIBG or the KVK, would stand up and say, okay, we're now going to issue these credentials. And yes, there are developments in that direction, but I don't think we will be able to do this in the next year. So the question is, are we going to create a workaround for this? One of the options could be issuing credentials ourselves, like the NUTS Foundation. But then we get a special position in the network, which from the beginning we said we will not going to do this. But perhaps this is what the network needs. So I think it's interesting to see that your needs are overtaking our planning. So it's good.
That I didn't want to say it earlier, but it does seem like your roadmap is it was based on like tweaking and stabilizing and making it stronger. But we have still some functional gaps that we see.
Yeah, and I think we see those as well, but I think there are 2 different tracks. So if you look at our roadmap, it's basically about how we are going to tweak the nuts node itself. But I think that for these use cases, the nuts node is already compatible. This is more on a higher level, and that is how are we going to synchronize these credentials? How are we going to work with issuing them? And I don't think the current net node doesn't support them, but we do have to make some decisions about what's the best practice and how to make sure that this spaghetti doesn't get too much spaghetti.
Yeah.
So maybe a small spoiler. Bob Kronenberg from SEDN said that the KVK IRMA credential will be available within weeks.
Oh, really?
But that still will be a mid-long term investment, I think, because we have to see what's in there. We have to probably on the functional end do some usage tests with the directors from care organizations, and of course there must be some kind of UI where they can sign something. It would be very interesting to do that, because it might be those CEOs that are saying, oh, we can't use IRMA because it's not
they have to use IRMA themselves
because the UX is not good enough for my employees. But if they can experience it for themselves and then use it, then maybe they're inclined to say, oh, it's not that hard. And
yeah, I think that would be huge if we finally have a good organization identified. Of course, it's not like the real organisatie database, but it's a very, very good first step. Also,
well, the funny fact is that CBG uses KVK as base.
Really?
Yeah. So the KVK is the base for all organization level data. One of the problems already there is that it's a database. So, and it's an old database. So it's a mess. Apparently all the hospitals are not under the category of hospitals, because that category was added later, and all the hospitals are still there. So that's
that's cool.
Okay, so but that only solves one part of the puzzle. So that everybody gets the same logical identifier.
Yeah, and then we should think about like issuing credentials not on the DID but on the identifier, for example.
Yeah.
And of course, we should introduce user interfaces or APIs where your customer can issue this KVK credential, of course. So you should, as a supplier, somehow identify your customer and let them scan a QR code. So there's many steps to make, and I think these should be designed, and then vendors like you can implement them. But there is some light at the horizon.
That's good. And for this point, I think we have kind of the same conclusion as for the consents, how to handle it. We just get in touch with you guys and hopefully schedule a moment to break it down and standardize it a bit more. What's the best practice to use here and across the board? Shall we agree on that?
Yep. Sounds good.
Okay. Let's keep it at this for now. I think we went over time and I also have another meeting to get to. But perhaps next meeting we can go over some other points if they're still remaining. I'll check with Yadi afterwards. But we're happy.
I will ask on Slack if everybody has items for the agenda for the next meeting 4 weeks. Cool. For now, because everybody's still here, so obviously nobody has a meeting, or this is the best one. For the other attendees, does somebody still has a 5-minute item they want to ask or discuss? Because we always have some time for questions, but over time.
So some practical questions, something you walked into recently, going to production, perhaps databases, data stores. Everybody using Vault already?
Well, I have another question. I hope the whole meeting is not going to be about just Edwin and me, but hey, there you go. The Java client, it was updated with V5.
Yes, so not officially supported.
No, okay.
But
Understood.
Rijn is responsible.
I just wanted to mention something about that. When
Oh, okay.
when you the one that's it's generated from the Open API spec, and then when you use it, it always it wants to use an authorization a bearer token for the requests to the nuts node, and I understood that's because we want to be able to support that the nuts APIs get demand and access token. But that kind of broke the Java client, because that will always go searching for a bearer token, but the bearer token isn't set, so it'll just always fail since the last release. Rijn, maybe you and I should just discuss that in the Slack channel.
Yeah, I was testing that on Mondays, and I saw that it didn't work, and I didn't see why. So can I just make an issue in my repo, and then I'll maybe this weekend. Today it's Friday. Yeah, we can just tomorrow. So yeah,
Sure. Yeah, no problem.
Yeah. Okay. And then
Okay.
just
do that.
make it a sheet.
Okay, so I think this is it. I'd like to thank everybody for attending, and I'll edit the video, post it on YouTube, and hopefully you will all be in the meeting the next time.
Yes.
Let's say that's in 4 weeks, so that's January. So everybody have a nice weekend and nice holiday.
Yeah. Thank you for your
Thanks.
questions.
You too.
All right. See you.